Hello, I was muted. But hi, good evening, everyone, or depending on where you are in the world. Hello. My name is Jody Minnis. I am the Exhibitions and Programming Director here at Turn Gallery, and you are joining me in conversation with two amazing critical thinkers. We will be talking primarily about art residencies in the Caribbean. And this conversation was inspired because at Turn, we just closed an exhibition by Leasho Johnson, which was titled An Unmistakable Softness. And one of the beautiful kind of nuances of that exhibition is that Leisho, who is a Jamaican artist based in Chicago, spent about 3 months here in New Providence in the Bahamas making the work, which means that the work had to kind of change because of, some of the limitations of the Caribbean. However, it's still, his practice as we know it and we love it. So I'm here with Kearra Amaya Gopee and Ashleigh Deosaran, and I will now add them into the conversation. Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
So I'm gonna do that awkward thing where you have your bio in front of you, and I didn't edit it, so it's the full thing. So I'm gonna start. I'm gonna start with Ashleigh. Ashleigh Deosaran is a doctoral candidate in art history at Northwestern University. Her research engages modern and contemporary Caribbean art through the lenses of critical race theory, queer studies, eco-criticism, and anti-colonial thought. After earning a BA in Fine Arts and Psychology from Pace University, she completed her MA in Modern Art, Critical and Curatorial Studies at Columbia University. Ashleigh's recent curatorial projects include Video Carib X in collaboration with Alice Yard at Documenta 15, and The Living Image of Sound, Notes on Jazz and Protests at Northwestern at the Block Museum of Art, where she served as a curatorial fellow. She has completed additional fellowships at the Council for Race and Ethnic Studies and the Social Science Research Council, and earned a graduate certification in Gender and Sexuality Studies as a Mellon Fellow at Northwestern. She previously held curatorial positions at the Art Foundation and the Public Art Fund in New York. Her writing can also be found in React Review, a responsive journal for art and architecture, Hemisphere, Visual Culture of the Americas, Field Magazine, and Pre-Literary Magazine. So that's Ashleigh. And then we have Kearra. I don't know why your names are not showing on the bottom, but it's okay. So I may have to help me with the names as we go. But Kearra Amaya Gopee is an anti-disciplinary visual artist from Carapichaima. Kairi, did I get that right?
Carapichaima. Kairi.
Carapichaima. Kairi, the larger of the twin island nation known as Trinidad and Tobago, living on Lenape land. Okay.
Correct.
New York, thank you. New York, using video, sculpture, sound, writing, and other media that identify both violence and time as primary conditions that undergird the anti-Black world in which they work, a world that they are intent on working through myriad collective interventions. They render this violence elastic and atemporal, leaving ample room for the consideration and manipulation of its history, implications on the present and possible afterlives. Gopee has been developing an artist residency in Trinidad and Tobago titled A Small Place. They hold an MFA from UCLA, a BFA in photography and imaging from NYU, and are an alum of the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture. They were a 2023 fellow at Queer Art and a participant in the Whitney Independent Study Program. So, hello. Welcome to you both. Yeah, I wanted to have this conversation, like I said, because I think that even before kind of the formal gallery structures that we know now in the Caribbean, here like Turn, there was a lot of inter-Caribbean exchange, and that happened primarily through residencies. And the kind of like the foremost residency at the center of all of this, to my understanding, has been Alice Yard in Trinidad. I know that Alice Yard was started by a collective, but one of the most foremost names is Christopher Cozier to be coming out of that space. But I was wondering if you both could speak to me about the importance of having a space like Alice Yard in Trinidad. I haven't been to Trinidad myself, so if you could give me kind of from your perspective and understanding of the importance of a residency space like that to like the wider art ecosystem within Trinidad.
Should I start? Do you want to
You
start,
could go.
Kearra?
You could go. You could go. You could go.
I'll just say that I think what Alice Yard does, and Chris has a quote where he says, Alice Yard isn't a place, but it's a space. And I think something that Alice Yard has allowed at least me to think about, and I know other scholars and artists, is about the kind of spaces that we make together that are not necessarily tethered to geography or not necessarily tethered to a certain building or gallery space, but the actual atmosphere that we create when we have conversations with each other and when we create together and collaborate. So I think Alice Yard and places like Big Black Box and places like, NLS and Fresh Milk and, all these places that are kind of dotted around the Caribbean are spaces and not necessarily places that help us think more capaciously about what it means to engage as Caribbean people and to engage in Caribbeanness that is not necessarily about islands, even though it is. It's kind of it's kind of both. It's like a both and like it's
Yeah.
both the geography and not. It's both the atmosphere and land and sea. And also, I think, like in terms of what you were saying about exchange, like where scholars from other parts of the world could come to the Caribbean in a way that it's not just sort of the stay at the hotel and stay in your room and kind of lime in the lobby and just kind of not really be in neighborhoods like Woodbrook or Belmont or you know what I mean? So I think that there's a way
Mm-hmm.
that scholars can experience what Caribbean artists are actually asking themselves when they're unburdened by this idea of Caribbean art that is trafficked around in other spaces.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's really good. Kiara, would you like to?
Yeah. I mean, I'm just jumping off of what Ashley was saying too about this kind of untethering. But also, I feel like Alice Yard is important, in fact, because of how it untethers you from productivity in some instances, where there is like this regard for process as a very kind of sacred piece of movement. And I also think that in addition to that, Alice Yard has this thing that it's kind of like incredibly contemporary. And I think that in a region that is often historicized to death, um, where people act as if, you're kind of like relics of a past time, as if there's not people here living constantly, changing, moving, coming up with new ideas all the time. I feel like Alice Yard is a place where things remain contemporary and that they are able to provide for a resident. As because I was a resident there at some point too, where they're able to provide for a resident some sort of context beyond history,
Mm-hmm.
and also kind of makes it clear that you are also a little bit implicated in the making of the contemporary by being here. Um, but yeah,
Yeah, I think that's so interesting. Actually, when you spoke about these as spaces versus places, because there is like this fluidity to like my understanding of the place. Like it seems more philosophical than like I feel like I know Alice Yard and like I've been there and and even like the concept of like a yard, like what a yard is. So there's this yeah, it's kind of like a universality to this, like what it means to be Caribbean, what it means to be in a space, but also, like Kearra was saying, like this like objection to like formal ways of like understanding like art making and art practices. Um, and yeah, and like an objection to what we kind of like think needs to be in facilitation for you to make. Um, and I think that's very interesting. One thing that I could liken it to possibly is in the Bahamas, we had a space called Pop-Up Studios, which is like this like yeah, I miss pop-up so much. But it was like a lot of like artists that just had studio spaces, and through that, like there was a lot of exchange, there was a lot of dialogue, there was a lot of cross like collaboration that I think we don't see nowadays as well. That kind of like forces you to think of your practice outside of the boundaries of like a canvas, you know, like what is your practice in the context of thought, like what are you researching, how does like the discourse that you're developing in your studio like add to the wider discourse of the yeah, like that, not like what did you say, like over historicized like space, like how do you like actually engage in what is going on present in this space rather than yeah, just like zoning into the canvas, because I think you lose so much of beauty when you like approach a residency from solely the process. And I wanted to kind of segue a bit. Did you also do a residency at Alice Garrett, Ashleigh?
No, maybe one day, hopefully one day
Okay.
I could join like
Yeah.
the, pantheon of Alice gods.
That's
No,
fair.
I've spoken to Chris about it before, and it's funny you asked me that. It actually like also has it's just like a very present conversation right now because of course Alice Yard shows up in some of the research that I'm doing now, and it makes a lot of sense to like go home and have a residency there, especially because there's also like not to get, you know, not to like therapize myself in front of you, but there's also a lot of like I have my own ambivalent relationship to home as in my like family home and like family in general and like my relationship with my parents and stuff. So I think something that we could talk about when it comes to residencies and I could talk about from a personal like perspective is really just how to find pockets of home other than the place that you were necessarily raised or grew up in, and how to choose family outside of like, or how to even choose a legacy and ancestry that has to do with that level of kind of care and generosity. Like thinking about how Sean Leonard, one of the co-founders of Alice Yard, talks about Alice, like the Alice, as
Yeah.
being
Yeah.
a generous like soul and like really kind of the heart of this hub that is about accommodating everyone and or even pop up, of course there's this like
Mm-hmm.
ancestry of like real love and care and community. And so I think that for me, thinking about a residency at Algiers is it's exciting and it's also ambivalent in a way because it's kind of like you start to think about ways to go home that are outside of what the nostalgia really is for home, but still fulfilling and
Yeah.
still like full of love and care and just um also about intergenerational exchange. And if it's one thing that Alice Yard is about, it's about generations on generations. I mean, at this point, legacy is almost 2 decades, and
Mm.
artists that are pretty much canonical like did drafts of
Mm-hmm.
work at Alice Yard in like the early 2010s. So I yes, I'm a big fan and hopefully one day future resident.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. Yeah, I didn't. I haven't. This is all like very like nostalgia and moving for me because the first residency I did was at pop up, and it did have like that space, that sense of like legacy, that sense of home and family, and it forced me to be taught even though
Yeah,
I didn't see it as an educational space. But if you're around like older artists working and they're
yeah,
moving in and through the space, like they can't help but to like offer wisdom or offer critique, and that like you said, intergenerational exchange becomes like the most valuable thing that you could get from um just being in a place. And I think even as we are kind of like growing these industries within like the respective islands, I think that's something that is missing to an extent. I would say here, like in New Providence, because it's becoming like hyper commercial. So there's a little bit more distance between artists of different generations. Like you have to be like so intentional about like making that kind of community. But here I wanted to ask because I know that r- participating in residencies is such like a big part of um, your practice and how you. I think you mentioned that you've just been going through residencies for like quite a long time. Can you speak to your relationship with residencies and how it's like shaped kind of your thinking of what it would mean to craft something of not this like similar, but like what elements were there that came up that you were like, no, this is something that I need to bring home?
Yeah, I think I'm gonna stick up in it because I just want to get one more note out about Alicia really quickly, also
Yes. Yeah.
too, which is that I think for a residency that takes one artist at a time, the idea that the city is a collaborator is what makes it a massive success in that sense. Because of this idea,
Mm-hmm.
the yard and people passing through constantly. Like I remember when I was doing Alicia, there was like a constant flow of people using that space, even though they weren't designated residents, which was fascinating to me about how people come to own space, how people come to make space within a city in and of itself. And I'm not from Port of Spain, but it was
Okay.
reminiscent of the type of community collaborations that one would see elsewhere in the country that you wouldn't really relegate to the city
Mm-hmm.
per se. So that was one thing that I wanted to stick a pin in. And for me, with residencies, what had happened was I came into this in a really, really, really basic way where, once I finished undergrad, I thought about it and I said, well, I don't think that the way that my practice works lends itself easily to um, pursuing the traditional route of let me go see if I can like get a gallery. Let me go see
Mm-hmm.
if I could sell work in this particular way. And I sustain myself off of my practice. I'm making film and installation. No, I cannot.
Yeah,
So
I get it.
you know what I mean. So I was just like, okay, so there
Mm-hmm.
must be some other way that I could have a practice, maintain autonomy, and be able to travel, be able to make work, be able to meet new people, be able to terrorize space in different ways, and my implication in it. And so a lot of my friends at that point in time were older artists who would say like very funny things to me when they come back from residency. Like I went to this residency and they had really good bread. They had really good bread and better than all the bread at all the residencies I'd gone to. So I was just like, this is hospitality. Okay, this is hospitality.
Yes.
I
Yes.
see what this job is showing me. So I started getting curious about it in pursuit of bread, yes, but also because I was really curious about what makes these like what incentivizes artists to come to like
Mm-hmm.
to disrupt their lives for like three
Yeah.
months to a year, depending on where you are, um, to make work and challenge yourself and change your practice via interaction with other people or other landscapes. So that's where it kind of started for me and how it moved into me wanting to start a residency was because I could see the urgency on both sides of the coin, almost.
Yeah.
Where there is, I think, like a dire need for local artists to have more places to make work and think about their work critically, have places to study and talk to other artists on a regular basis outside of the university or outside of like Alicia, outside of the city, actually, per
Yeah.
se,
Yeah.
outside of the metropole or however you want to describe it. But then I also see like this really urgent need regionally for people to be in conversation with each other, which is a whole other conversation about funding that we
Yeah.
could get into and I could talk about for years. But it's about how
Yeah.
these programs are funded, the fact that it's so expensive to fly into Ireland, the fact that we're kind of by virtue of capitalism held arms apart from each other. And I think that the first I can't fix Caribbean Airlines, but I could make another space. I could make
Right.
another place for people to go when we figure that out.
Caribbean Airlines couldn't fix Caribbean Airlines.
Caribbean Airlines can fix
Listen.
Caribbean Airlines.
Listen to me.
You know, so I see it regionally and I see it internationally where we are having conversations that are siloed that should be happening all at once.
Yeah.
And I thought like residencies was a good way to kind of approach that. But yeah.
No, that's brilliant. Yeah, hospitality, like I get it. There's I get it. There's a place called ICE Bahamas. I think it's Institute for Collaborative Expression that was founded by Antonius Roberts. So it's like this former like ice factory place. And he was like leased the land. And the same thing, like one of the concerns that you said about local artists just having space to like make, to collaborate, to study and engage and show outside of university, because we lost pop up to a hurricane, and it just hasn't been able to get back on its feet yet, which left like this void. And then, you know, almost 10 years later here, I mean, like between like 8 years later, ICE is about. But one of the selling points is that there is a food truck there that sells really good food, you know. So, and it's one of the things that I enjoy about it. It's like it's outside of the downtown area, so a lot of the galleries that are in New Providence, which is like the main like touristic kind of like it's the capital city of the Bahamas. Most of the galleries are downtown, or they're like turn and they're like way out west. But ICE is like 5 minutes away from my house, like in the inner city of New Providence. So you have like they have like a garden, like they're like solar powered. So I think it's like these interjections into the space, not just for artists but for the community, because I think that there's something that's so like reciprocal when you put art back in the midst of the people. And then you take art outside of just like it's, I hate to say commercial again, but like you take it outside of that commercial context and you say, hey, like you can just engage with this. Like it's okay for artists and this kind of like language and discourse and this kind of like because art has a way of like taking over kind of space. It's okay to live with it in a symbiotic way. And yeah, I agree that there's because we're finding this now, like there's this need for like cross-regional conversations, like what they're doing in we're finding that, you know, the French-speaking Caribbean is having the same kind of conversations that we're having here in the English-speaking Caribbean. But like you said, like it costs an arm and a leg to even get to like Martinique or Guadeloupe, you know, from here. And one of the other residency projects that I thought was so brilliant was Caribbean Linked, that took 13 different artists to Aruba, all from the region. They had a writer who kind of doubled as a curator, depending on the the year, but that created kind of like a fraternity. So there are persons that I engage with now that was just like, hey, I saw that you did Caribbean Link too. I want to connect because I did it, and it's such like a unique experience. But one of the things that even with me personally, I didn't have a US visa at the time. So the easiest way was for me to go from Nassau, Miami, Aruba, but I would have to go like from Aruba, Miami to Nassau. I'd need a visa. I didn't have one. So I had to go from Aruba to Curacao to Jamaica, spend 4 days in Jamaica, and then go to Nassau. But luckily I got to see like NLS in Jamaica, which is such a incredible space. But yeah, like all of the points that you raised, Kiara, are literally things that people have been kind of like fighting to get resolved for the past like 20 years, thinking about how to like create these like linkages. But speaking about NLS, what I think is so interesting, and I'm gonna like approach this point from two different perspectives, so if I repeat myself, audience and panelists, forgive me. But when you Google like art residencies in the Caribbean, there are a lot of visual art residencies. And I think that like I understand like people are like, oh, you get inspired by, the geography of the space and you make some work. But Ashleigh and I actually met during curatorial summer intensive slash like residency. I think it was like 10 days. So it's quite intense, but I know that yeah, like it was intense. You got to see a lot of the islands. I wanted to ask, being from and I mentioned NLS because NLS has a curatorial and art writing fellowship that's been like extremely helpful to a lot of young curators. But I wanted to ask you, Ashleigh, how has coming back to the region, because I know that you're based in Chicago, how is coming back into the region, but through another like island context, after like engaging with so much discourse and scholarship about the region outside of the region, like how has that like kind of influence changed, swirled your curatorial thinking? Like what did that experience like birth from you, if it birthed anything?
Yeah, I would say, yeah, well, I had many intellectual babies after that trip, I
Yeah.
would say. I certainly did have a lot of thinking to do because, as you said, it was intense. Like, it was busy. It was 10 days. It was my first time in Nassau. So there was a lot to see. And I definitely was like, I was grateful to see Turn in person. I had like heard of Turn at Expo, and like, so it was interesting to kind
Mhm.
of like go to a place that kind of along the lines we've been thinking about, like was a space that I feel like I already knew to a certain extent.
Mm,
Um,
yeah.
and obviously it was great to like meet you and connect. But I think since then I've been thinking a lot about the places that we were. It's almost like when we actually were there in person, everything happened so fast that it was hard to like
Yeah.
really catch up to what I was like really experiencing in the moment in my body. But now when I look back at that experience, I find that the thing that I noticed most about places like Nine or places like even Ice and Togant Antonius is about how kind of there's an emphasis on slowness and a kind of organic growth, and even to a certain extent, like flying under the radar, such that, you know, especially artist led organizations are interested in what it means to kind of evade certain gazes, which I find curatorially challenging and interesting. What is it like
Mm,
to have exhibitions that are about opacity? Or what is it like to
yeah.
have a show about invisibility? Or of reaching a certain gaze, a certain anthropological gaze specifically, or touristic gaze. So I thought that was the most striking, like, takeaway I had from a lot of those spaces, particularly because it comes up against, it's the kind of hospitality that comes up against what we think of when we think of Caribbean accommodation, like literally
For
hotels.
sure.
It's kind of the opposite. It's kind of a inversion of that. So it's not about the coerced service. It's more just about letting artists do their thing without having the performance of Caribbeanness be like a top priority. So, like, what do artists ask themselves when they're not being forced to perform certain ways?
Yeah.
I think it's it's a challenge for somebody like me who is used to kind of being the only Caribbean person in a room or a seminar or whatever, to try to think about the ways that I perform as a Caribbean scholar.
Yeah.
You know what I
Yeah.
mean? And I do, and I have codes and code switch, and you know what I mean? Like, I have
Yeah.
different
Same.
languages for different spaces. And so it's interesting to kind of even think about the Francophone Caribbean too, because I feel like within the Anglophone Caribbean, we have so many different languages and we have so many different
Yeah.
modes of speaking. And so between Nassau and Port of Spain and even Carapichaima and, like, you know what I mean? Like, we have all these different like modalities. And yet at the
Yeah.
same time, I found us really speaking the same language there, which I appreciated a lot.
Hmm.
So yeah, I think just taking away just the idea of, how to create an art history that doesn't coerce artists into being fully legible.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's so like poignant, because I was thinking about the fact that a lot of these places you have to be invited into. Like Nine, for example, the studio space that Leisho worked in is a private studio space. And it is legit like right behind pop-up. But pop-up is super open. So no matter any time of day, if someone just wanted to pull in the yard, you can, and you could hang out and all of that. And it was a community space, whereas Nine is like, this is our community, you know. Yeah, and you have to like be you have to be invited in. You also like have to have like someone has to usher you into that space, because even if someone says, oh, just like come along, and it's your first time on the island, you will get lost.
I mean,
Yeah, so I think
I appreciated it, even just literally like 5 minutes before we started talking, like Googling it and having it be
mhm.
ungoogleable to me is just like such a powerful, like, I don't know. I just think that there's something so interesting about an art residency, an art space, an art hub that is kind of like, a known secret,
Yeah,
an unwritten kind of like powerhouse, And
yeah,
I felt it when we were there. And I also like kind of comparing it to what Kearra said about the yard. Like, there's this kind of inside outside that gets a little bit fuzzier when you start to
mhm.
think about different models of the way these spaces function in the Caribbean and elsewhere. But something about Caribbean people, like something about the way that we are able to like be hyper visible and also like traffic in this opacity is something that's very interesting to me.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's something you mentioned, like artist-led spaces, kind of yeah, just being different, because as you were talking, I was like, Tessa Whitehead, who's the proprietor of Nine, Tessa's practice is all about opacity, and it's all about
Sure.
yeah, like being amongst the landscape, and the landscape being like you and the landscape are both like personalities within the work. And I think that she approaches Nine in the same vein, like with this opacity, with this hiddenness, allowing Nine to be a part of the landscape, be of it, but also allow the landscape to protect it as well. But when you mentioned slowness, I was like, this is beautiful. Because one of the things that I thought was so um, different about Kiara's residency, a small space, is that a small place. I'm sorry, Jamaica Kincaid would not be happy with me. But it was that you you said that the residency is like it's a long-term residency, so it's like a multi like year kind of very formatted residency for 4 people. The goal is to host 4 people at a time. Would you can you talk to us a little bit about like the psychology of the slowness of the pace? What does, because I'm thinking about like what you said earlier about being immersed in the landscape and becoming not just a tourist as a resident within the within this like new space, but allowing yourself to like acclimate. Like, can you speak to like what really yeah, like why so long? Not that it's a bad thing, because I think it's brilliant. But I think that there's something like beautiful there that I'd like to explore.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it is that long largely because I want people to wrestle, to really, really wrestle with the stakes of being in a place. Especially as somebody, especially when I'm talking about having like international people come in for a long period of time, I need them to understand that, you may never become a resident of a place. You may never. So what does it mean to then operate out as an outsider? What does it mean to make work as an outsider, to kind of be at peace with that designation almost? That sometimes the work that you do isn't always about assimilation and about being part of a larger thing per se, but also just thinking about yourself as like a singular contained unit that comes with its own
Mm,
baggage that cannot necessarily be, that is not and that baggage is not necessarily the responsibility of the place that you're in or the people
yeah.
who are there. Um, so that 2 year period is really for people to come to terms with themselves.
No,
um,
that's yeah.
That's real.
yeah,
Yeah.
because I think a lot of people do residencies with the kind of premise that I will become integrated into something, or that I will learn
Mhm.
something outside of myself, and that I will somehow become a part of, a citizen of, a member of, when sometimes the most you can do is recognize that you may not necessarily achieve that status, but you do have a role to play as somebody whose presence implicates particular political concerns.
For sure. Yeah.
Um, but also it was very slow because it's bifurcated. So the first year will be on Zoom for most people. It'll be on Zoom
Mhm.
largely because I want people to take time to start interfacing with people who are already doing work locally, um, and take that time to really study Trinidad's history overall, before coming in and getting kind of sidelined by all of these things happening beyond you. But I want
Mhm.
to make sure that people are putting in the legwork in that first year before they even set foot on the island for international
Yeah.
residents. And for local residents, I'm thinking about it in terms of like them reacquainting themselves with being political agents within Trinidad and Tobago, who are making work and have a responsibility to make things that are provoking, that are challenging, that are interesting, to a public outside, especially when you think about it in terms of what everybody knows Trinidad for, which is carnival. How does art move outside of that carnival economy, and how do we make sure that people are recognizing that things don't stop just because carnival stops?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
there's still things happening. There's still things that require commentary. It cannot be put in this capsule of time.
Yeah.
So it's long, so people have time to really grapple with those ideas before coming together in one space in the second year. And really kind of seeing what they can learn from each other or lack thereof, or not. It may not work. It may not work. That's the other thing to think about too with something like this, is like the possibility of failure and what could come out of failure. It may not gel. It may not all come together, but who knows?
Yeah. And I think that's like a beautiful thing to like not force an outcome and not to like force this like, yeah, like this like symbiosis. But I think like it's so interesting to like have this conversation like within like the construct of like tourist economies, because I think that this is like my brain is like hitting so hard against so much as we're speaking, because yeah, we are so familiarized with people coming in like short term, whether it's like cruise ship people on cruise ships, people like coming for holiday, and like the longest they'll stay is probably like 3 weeks. But they don't think of themselves as isolated and responsible for themselves. And well, I shouldn't make that general statement, but most tourists do not think of themselves as singular beings within a space that has to be responsible for the space that they are coming into. There's a innate need to be catered to, for all the information to be handed to them up front, for everything to be made plain. So to have like a residency where it's like, hey, sit with yourself for a minute, understand that this place has existed before you've come. There's a history here. Your presence here also has like a history here, and a political history at that. And maybe then you have to shift. The space doesn't have to shift. And I think having, being in, like nations that consistently contorts itself for the visitor, it's very jarring to think of a program that will not move. Like, the failure is not on the institution. The failure is not even on the individual, but it's just a fact that something did not work, which does not then require. Maybe it requires introspection by the visitor, but it doesn't require like drastic change on the institution. I think that that's such a radical concept, within like these spaces where we see, like for John Canoe and for Carnival, there's like so much fabrication of space, there's so much accommodation, there's so much pomp and pageantry, and then you're left and then it's like, what is the space outside of that? And I think it's so beautiful because I'm thinking about like, how do you truly like digest this space if you're just passing through? And then, and one of the things that was so interesting to me when Leasho came down was that, there was a lot of limitations to being in the Caribbean as well. So how do you adapt to the limitations of being in this new space, especially if you're coming from a space like the UK or from like North America, where convenience and accessibility is like bred into the culture of the space? Like the Caribbean can be inconvenient at times. Like, what do you do when the power goes out? What do you do when you can't find like the very specific brand of toothpaste or something that you use? Like, how do you just invite yourself to then be malleable to that? And I think that's what residencies are supposed to do. They're supposed to force you to be malleable. So I think that's quite brilliant. I think that comes to the end of my questions. I feel like I have notes, y'all. Like, taking notes. I'm like, I'm learning.
I know. I feel like I'm learning. Are we learning?
We are learning.
So.
It's educational.
Can I ask you a question, Kearra?
Yeah.
I'm curious about like connecting multiple different things that you said over the course of the conversation, and just I feel like I'm so like saturated with like kind of images and textures from what you said, like the idea of breaking bread, the idea of like being untethered, the idea of time and breaking a certain calendar year that's so built up around certain like high points or high seasons. And I just like, I'm very intrigued by like the approach to a residency that is all about this, like, if not emphasis, at least embrace of the possibility of failure or the possibility that things won't work. And there's something so powerful, I think, as Jody was just getting at, about being kind of intransigent in the face of this constant contortion that's all around you as a Caribbean place. So just, do you feel like that has always been a strategy that you've been thinking about, even in your films? Because I'm thinking about Carmela so much also during our conversation, because I'm just like, I'm thinking about eating, I'm thinking about family, I'm thinking about research. So, but mostly I'm thinking about like vampire lore and like bringing soil to like with you, right? And bringing like place with you to a certain extent as you leave and come back. And just that's such an exercise in adapting, you know? And so I wonder how your films are informing, if they inform, like the way that you have thought about building this residency.
Yeah, no, definitely they're co-constitutive,
Yeah.
10,000%. I feel like the stubbornness that I have in my videos definitely does translate to like a kind of like fixity
Yeah.
about the ideas of, well, this is what a place is, but we can bring things to it and see what can happen once, things are in the room together.
Yeah.
That this place existed, this place or even this strategy existed long before I was a taught. And it's not to say that they can't learn, it's not to say that they can't move, it's not to say that it won't ever come up with something else. But but there are things that are fundamental to it that will not be moved,
Hmm.
you know. But I do think that, yeah, I think that my video practice kind of lends itself to building a residency often because it's so collaborative in that sense that you have to be prepared to be with people,
Yes.
um and you have to meet people where they are.
Yeah.
You have to meet people where they are. It's really,
And
I
be
have
met
no
where you are sometimes.
exactly.
Meet and be
Exactly.
met, you
Meet
know?
and be met.
And something about like that negotiation in a safe, to a certain extent, like safe environment. And when I say safe, I mean like unshackled in a certain way by like the formalism of certain like residencies and institutions elsewhere, like in the US or the UK, and unburdened by like that performance of, you know, whatever is expected or a type, or even the
Productivity.
hyper
Yeah.
awareness of like being perceived a certain way. And I think like I like what you said about stubbornness. I think that there's like you are afforded like an opportunity to be stubborn in a way that sometimes you feel like one maybe feels like is not afforded usually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's so beautiful. Yeah, I was like, when I read your bio and it says that you are an anti-disciplinary visual artist, it's like, I'm gonna love Kearra. Like, this conversation is gonna be
Welcome to the
brilliant.
club. Welcome to the fan
Yeah.
club.
No, but I think that you have to, like, you kind of have to like adopt all of this like stubbornness and this like innate like rejection. Like you have to be like so intentional about what you accept and what you reject because of like what we spoke about, like this like formalism, like the formalism, the like over like historicized like modern art history that we have, this like over over performance and all of that. Yeah, so I really appreciate it. I really appreciate both of your practices. Ashley, I just love how your brain works. So yeah, I will say loudly if anybody in the audience has a question. If you type it on YouTube, you'll be able to see it. Um, if any of you have a question, or if there's something that you wanted to like speak about, we have like 10 minutes. So I'm just full. Like you, I'm full as well. And I'm like, like I'll just keep repeating things.
It's also not often that you like are able to like really indulge sometimes. Like it's not often that one is like really sated. So I'm like very excited to be in also constant conversation with you all. And I guess if I have a question, it would be for you, Jody, just about kind of you're an artist and you are a curator and you like do the work, and I just wonder, like, in thinking about Leasho's work / your work, which is like, I know that you have work coming up at Turn soon about like kind of this like shattered, like these fragments that you've been working with that I love. And I just wonder about your experience of, if any, of residencies or of this idea of performing with all these different hats on and in all these different spaces. I remember we talked about code switching a little bit, and just like what your experience is in general of this kind of tug of war sometimes, what it feels like.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think so I'll start on the curator side. So there is a bit of performance, a lot of performance, actually, because the gallery is situated on the property of a hotel. So the Island House is the hotel, and we're like down the hill from the Island House, which means that a lot of the guests that we get on a day to day are, persons who come to the hotel. Luckily, the Island House has a clientele that's quite varied. So you'd have like different curators, writers, artists, and stuff who come in and are like, whoa, this is like pretty awesome. But you still have to like perform a certain level of knowledge of like the wider like global art world and like art market to give like a validity to what we're doing in a contemporary sense. Which has been kind of like a hard thing to do because as an artist, I'm like, the work is the work, it's good. I have nothing else to say. You know?
Yeah.
But then you have to, but then you have to like explain and like, and then you forget that like, oh, all of this like Caribbean art history that I have, which is, I'm still learning. It's not public knowledge. It's not like wide public knowledge. So then you have to go into like this like consistent like teaching and this like performing Caribbeanness to a certain extent while performing professionalism and intellect and all that sort of stuff. So that then becomes like a little I do it because I love the work. Like I really believe in all of the artists that we work with. So I'm like, I will do this for you.
Totally.
But yeah, and I think that's why I lean so heavily into kind of abstraction and opacity in my practice.
Right.
Yeah, because I'm like, it is what it is. I don't have it, because even though I wear multiple hats, like I can't fragment myself. So if my capacity in one instance is not there, then, but then I will also say that from doing residencies, one of the best residencies that I did actually was at the Current, which is a hotel. It's a gallery within a hotel, like this mega resort called Bahamar. And yeah, at the time it was just like glass window all around, so it looks like a storefront. So tourists were passing me as I was working, and it was almost like being in a fishbowl. However, it was I got to exist as a hotel worker, as an artist, as a tourist at the same time. And I think that that has been one of the most like pivotal experiences because, I had staff lunch with all of the staff every day. So I went into the cafeteria and I ate with them and I spoke with them. And I went through the back alleys and channels to get in and out of the space. But then when I was in, the studio working, I would have really interesting conversations with tourists that would be like, "Oh, I saw your work outside. Like, can you tell me about it?" I'm like, "Sure." And they were like, "This is so refreshing to have in this space," So they were pulled out of the fantasy of, like sun and sea, and like they were also humanized because they're like, "Oh, you're telling me about this very human experience through your work. I will now show up as human. I'm not showing up as consumer in this interaction." I think that was jarring, but it was yeah, I was like, I tell anybody, I'm like, if there's any residency to do here as like a local artist, do that. Yeah, and then I think even when we have like other Caribbean artists like um come in to like do stuff at Turn, I'm constantly reminding myself that, oh yeah, like it's okay if what they expected of the place is not what they get, like it's okay. Um yeah, it's a long, long answer, but
It's fun. I mean, I like the idea of this gray area where like expectations are suddenly shattered and people aren't really playing the rules anymore that they thought that they were
yeah,
assigned. So
right.
I think that that's also there's like a beauty in proximity and also sometimes like
Mhm.
chaos in proximity that we could just leave as chaotic and not have to solve.
Yeah, and I think one of the beautiful things, just going back to what Kiara was speaking about, is that there's this like it's such like a beautiful process to realize that like to like shed, like to shed expectation, to shed like preconceived like notions of what how you think that you're gonna show up and how
Mm.
you think the space is supposed to show up for you. Like it's a beautiful thing to just like to surrender to what is going on. And I think that's been the most beautiful part of engaging in residencies to me. Like just like being like, oh, okay, I have to surrender to this now. Yeah.
I have, because the comments on YouTube, I don't think they're enabled, but my friend texted me a question.
Oh, okay. Thank you, friend.
Um,
So sorry.
I'll just read it. Question is around queerness and addressing that with residents and with people in the community. Is there a plan around this? How will some of these dialogues be framed? I'm getting, and that's for a small place generally, I
Okay.
think.
Mhm.
So remember I was saying that there is like one whole year of study that happens before you even get there. That will be queerness will definitely be on the forefront of what people are thinking about when they're thinking about Trinidad. They're thinking about Trinidad's own very vibrant queer history, actually. That people like to act like it doesn't exist, but it's a real thing that's happening all the time. And so partially in that first year is where I really want to start introducing people to other people who are working on the ground. So it's also thinking about art, yes, but also thinking about organizing second, and thinking about how do I get people in contact with the communities that they care for, as
Mhm.
early as possible, um, and in the safest way possible. So thinking about connecting people to groups like feminine, feminine. I always get this name wrong. I always want to say feminine TT, but it's femininity.
Yeah.
You know which one I'm talking about
They
with
did it
Ashley
on
and how
purpose.
they did it on purpose, and every time it catch me, I'm like, Ashley, why did you name it that? um, like Kaiso and a lot of all the other groups that are working and like independent people who organize by themselves in whatever capacity. Um, So yeah, it will be definitely at the forefront and thinking about how to integrate this into literally integrating this into your study about Trinidad as a nation, period. As queerness as something that is also constantly being negotiated all the time. I think Trinidad is such a queer place to
It's
me.
such a queer place. It's such a gender fluid space.
Yeah,
It's a mecca. And people don't understand and people don't appreciate how arts and culture, even the very co-opted, like kind of nationalist idea of Trinidadian arts and culture, is inherently queer.
yes,
And
Mm.
you know, that I so appreciate and love that like education for that first year is going to be kind of
yeah,
taking that entry point, because yeah, I find it disturbing always for people who
Mm.
have not come to the Caribbean but have a lot of preconceived notions about, you know, and yeah, like homophobia as it is everywhere, queerphobia as it is everywhere,
Yeah,
misogyny as it is everywhere, but that don't understand also pockets of freedom that have popped up,
right.
particularly as they overlap with artist spaces. Like I remember when Black Box used to be Bohemia back in the day. I remember being there on a Carnival Tuesday night, and that was the first time I really entered a queer space. The first time
hmm
I ever
Mm.
experienced like true like, freedom in any sense. And I mean, I don't know what other space or place could give that kind of experience. And you know, I'm so grateful. It was such an awakening. It's great to be queer.
it's
It's good to be queer, you
like
know.
I think about, you know what I think about all the time? The inherent nobility of man
Yes.
Mm.
Yes, as a
and
queer
how
piece.
as a queer piece, like I need people to be doing the queer readings
Yes.
of how queerness is literally embedded in the architecture of Trinidad and Tobago, even though it's like a
Mm.
sad allegory because we lost it,
Yeah. And
but
how
it's still something to think about.
Carlisle Chang's life has been again, or his story has again been co-opted in this
Yeah,
nationalist narrative with no with no
no
mention of.
mention.
So
Mm.
yes, look out for chapter 2 of my dissertation.
I can't wait for it.
I'm looking forward to
Just
reading
gonna do a
it.
shameless plug whenever that gets written.
Don't worry. Um,
Oh, but yeah,
uh, uh, awesome. This is such like a joyful and beautiful conversation. I really, really, really am grateful to you both for your time and for your generosity of thought and spirit. We are 3 minutes over, so we're going to say good night. Thank you to everyone who joined us live, and if you are joining us, in a replay, thank you for watching. Um, Unmistakable Softness by Leasho Johnson is currently down. However, we have a new show coming up opening on March 27th called To Scatter Seeds. So you could visit our Instagram, Facebook, whatever, it's Turn Gallery. And if you want to get more information about anything, you can email us at info@turngallery.com. So thank you both. I'll end the stream, but stay on, okay? So I'm going to sign off. Bye.